It's not
Hmm.
a film about archaeology.
Hmm.
It's a film about, well, more than anything, it's a film about somebody trying to find a focus to their life at a time when their life it's seemingly out of control.
Hmm.
Um, the
That sounds like a film.
character
That sounds like a film about archaeology to me. Hello, and welcome back to Unstratified Entertainment. I am joined, as ever, by my amazing co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, and today we're going to be talking about The Lost King. Hello, Andy. How are you doing?
And now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of Yark.
You know,
I'm fine. It's great. It's great to be back doing an unstratified. Looking forward to this one.
uh, between you and me, viewer, that's the third time we've done this, and every time it gets better. So, so thank you,
There's
Andy.
actually there's a story behind that performance, which hopefully we'll get time to cover later because it's part of the fascinating backstory of this whole Richard III issue.
And what an issue! What an issue! Where to begin? I mean, first of all, we're talking about The Lost King, a film that recently had its US cinematic release, although had a summer 2022 release in the UK and some other
Autumn, it
territories.
was all autumn, in fact. In fact, it was released first in Canada.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That they did a staggered release through Canada, then in the UK,
Yeah.
out to streaming services, and then it's had a cinematic release in the States very recently.
Yeah. Exactly. And all through that, it's been discussed, shall we say, charitably, by archaeologists in all quarters of social media. It seems some archaeologists getting very animated, others becoming, I would say, potentially a slight bit, maybe possibly obsessed with this movie. Others legitimately shrugging and going, "What's the problem?" So it's garnered a lot of attention and opinion from our colleagues. But
Arguably more from the archaeological world than it has from the cinema
well,
world.
yeah,
But we'll come to that later too, I think.
yeah. Well, and I mean in that sense, I think yeah, I think some of the archaeological discourse gave this movie free publicity. A lot of free publicity. Lots of articles written off the back of it, certainly, of archaeologists disagreeing about the movie. But you know, for you and I, this was one of the first times that we really sort of communicated and worked together. At the time, 20, it was February the 4th, 2013, I think, was the
That
announcement.
was the press conference.
Yeah,
The work actually went on
in
in the
2012.
autumn. In fact, in fact, in the over the autumn bank holiday period, end
Yeah,
of the summer, beginning of the autumn of 2012. Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. So we were sort of going back and forth on some of the coverage. And
Mm.
some again some specifics about how certain key characters were behaving as well at the time. But I do
Mm.
remember on the 4th of February 2013 releasing a 2 or 3 minute quick video. So like, it's him. Oh my goodness, it's Richard III. And
Which I think we should link to below the line actually, because we are talking about modern archaeological history
yeah,
here.
yeah. I look a lot young. Well, I look about 10 years younger at least. Um, but the point being though is that it also spawned, I would say, a bit of an archaeological meme. Now every time a car park is being excavated, people are looking apparently for a king, and actually there has been a couple of monarchs, I do believe, who've been identified as possibly being below car parks in the past 10 years as well.
Well, actually, I don't know about car parks. The one I remember most, I think, is it Henry I who's meant to be underneath Reading Prison,
Well, there's that, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was a bishop under a car park.
or was it King Stephen under Reading Prison? It's one of the early orange events. Uh,
Well, the point is, we've had a lot of kings, and they seem to sometimes be
there was the
buried.
Prittlewell Prince on a roundabout.
So, I mean, yeah, it's not unusual now. Even in the US, when they start digging a car park, people go, "Oh, we lost a king." So it started a meme,
Yeah.
but it also, in that sense, captured people's imaginations as to the
Mm.
process of archaeology, as to the time scales that we're dealing with in terms of how is it possible to bury a monarch and then have them eventually underneath a car park in Leicester. And also as well, there was some excellent pioneering DNA research attached to this project that helped to tie up loose ends and resulted in some interesting conversation in and around the eventual and final resting place of Richard's remains. But I suppose, I mean, the question is, what do you remember around about this time? Do you have any particularly strong memories?
I do because at the time, we're dealing with archaeologists trying to deal with a legend,
Yeah.
basically,
Mm.
Richard III. Well, maybe I'll do a bit. We'll have a chance to talk about a little bit of the backstory of Richard III in popular culture and why
Yeah.
this film of all films would be capturing a kind of profile that another film referencing an archaeological excavation, even something like The Dig
Hmm.
last year or the year before last now, wouldn't.
No.
But no, at the time of the work, the Leicester University Archaeological Service and the Looking for Richard project were doing the work in the car park on the site of the of Greyfriars in Leicester. They were looking for a legend. So was I, because I was working on the Burma Spitfires project at the time.
Of course, yeah.
The wonderful irony, yeah, I mean, but also I was I had friends and colleagues who were moving on the outer fringes of the solar system of the Richard III project.
Right. Right.
In medievalists and people working in the Midlands and so on.
Mm.
And so one heard whispers. They did a very good job at keeping a lid on the thing.
Hmm.
And again, for quite understandable reasons.
Mm.
And of course, the irony, when I came to watch that press conference the following February, as you did, um, they had their legend and they proven that, our legend, the Buried Spitfires of Burma, it was a hoax. And we proved it was a hoax through using archaeology.
Hmm.
The Leicester team used archaeology to show that no, the remains of the last Plantagenet king killed at the Battle of Bosworth hadn't been thrown into the River Soar at the Reformation.
Mm.
He was still there under the Church of the Grey Friars, and brilliant research and then science proved that they had their man. It was a remarkable story. It's one that's going to be talked about for a long time.
It is, and actually, I want to pick up at some point on that aspect of research because this film, which we both, we both pay good money to rent and stream digitally, and I watched with my in-laws. We all watched them to watch this movie together.
Mm.
The film, on the one hand, seems to be a very charming, fantastical tale. I would say that, for example, the score for the film is slightly overbearing, possibly. It has like a slightly sort of Harry Potter kind of vibe going to it. There are, I think, as you pointed out just before we started recording, there are magical realism elements going on in it. But I would also say that I'm very mixed on how archaeologists are portrayed in this film, which I think is one of the core issues that many of our colleagues highlighted. I mean, where would you start with the Lost King film? Because obviously we all know the story of what happened in terms of the outcome of this excavation, but this is the story of seemingly the research that led up to it.
I wouldn't start with the archaeology. It's
Hmm.
not a film about archaeology.
Hmm.
It's a film about, well, more than anything, it's a film about somebody trying to find a focus to their life at a time when their life is it's seemingly out of control.
Mm-hmm.
The
That sounds like a film.
character,
That sounds like a film about archaeology to me.
when the film
It's coffee,
opens,
not whiskey. I promise you. So go on.
it's like the late great Dave Allen and the suspiciously brown coloured liquid that used to be in his glass tumbler as he sat on his stool telling tall stories. This is a tall story. This is magical realism. It's not a film about archaeology, right? It's taking as its jumping off point
Hmm.
an archaeological story, or a story that reached its culmination through archaeology. But
Mm-hmm.
what it's actually about, and the Lost King is literally true, but also it's metaphorically true because Richard is one of the most elusive and controversial monarchs in certainly British history,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
English history.
Mm-hmm.
And we can again we can talk about that cultural backstory in a minute. And the film is about somebody whose life is apparently drifting. They're a bit lost. They've got a long-term medical condition
Mm-hmm.
that is debilitating,
Mm-hmm.
um, and their marriage is in trouble,
Mm-hmm.
um, and they've got two teenage children and a job that seems to be going nowhere, and it's it's Philippa Langley's story, which is hardly a surprise because it's actually based on Philippa Langley's book.
Well, and that's the thing is that the film starts out. It says this based on a true story. Lots of films do
Which it
that.
is.
Lots of films
They
do
did.
that.
They
Yep, yep.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But then it says
Yeah.
underneath
Okay. Well,
her
shut up.
her story.
Yeah.
And in that sense, the film is made with obviously her as a resource. It therefore has her
As a
perspective.
producer, she's given a
Well,
producer credit.
yeah, but if as you say, it's based on her
Hmm.
book in that sense.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so it
Well,
ha-
so her book, I should say the book she co-wrote, in fact, with a historian called Michael Jones.
right.
But yeah, primarily it's Philippa Langley's story. Yeah.
But the point is, it has her perspective, their
Hmm.
perspective, her editorialized perspective.
Hmm.
It will have, therefore, an agenda, which comes from a point of view, and
Hmm.
certainly the way it's been marketed has been one of underdog gets one over on stuffy academics, and also not least woman gets one over on a chauvinistic profession. Whether or not that actually comes through entirely in the film, I think I would debate, actually. I don't think necessarily archaeologists are shown to be chauvinist, but that's certainly something that's come about in the marketing for this film.
We'll come back to that, I think, because I think that's a crucial distinction, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly, I think it has to be said that the bulk of the criticism
Mm-hmm.
of the film has come from some people associated with the University of Leicester,
Mm-hmm.
um, which was the umbrella organisation behind the University of Leicester Archaeological Service, who did the excavation,
Mm-hmm.
and people who used those people at the University of Leicester Archaeological Service as their primary source in writing about the Richard III story,
Yes.
the Richard III discovery story.
Yeah. Okay, so you keep on saying we'll come back to that. So where would you like to start? Where should we start in talking about this film?
I think we should start
Mm-hmm.
with a one of the longest lasting controversies in English history,
Okay.
which is was Richard III, younger brother of King Edward IV, king for just 3 years, killed at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485,
Mm-hmm.
a hero, a villain, or something in between?
Yeah.
Now, for a long, long time, uh, Richard has been seen as one of the darkest villains in in English history.
Mm-hmm.
He's the Hunchback King who murdered his way to the throne, murdered his own nephews, and ended up screaming for a horse at the Battle of Bosworth, being cut down where he stood by Henry VII, who brought peace and unity to the kingdom, and founded the Tudor dynasty.
And betrayed the Welsh in the process, but I won't get into that. Go on.
Even though he fought, even though he was fighting under the Red Dragon of Cadwallader.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, go on.
But look, yeah, within sort of 40 years of Richard's death,
Mm-hmm.
the modern sort of the dark legend had been established by Sir Thomas More, who wrote the history of King Richard III, where he described it was the king's biography. He hatches the plot to murder the princes in the Tower, his own nephews, one of whom is arguably the rightful king, while sitting on the privy.
Right.
It's a really, it's loaded with symbolism.
Mm.
The withered arm and the hunchback. in the folklore of the period is, you know, it's the withered personality, the personification of evil, you know.
Yeah, and well, also a branch of royalty that they want to portray as having come to its end, having
That's right.
no
and
viable
and
fruit
yeah,
to give. Yeah. Mm,
absolutely.
mm,
And that particular narrative reaches its culmination. And you know, I started with a joke about Olivier's Richard III.
mm-hmm,
That was a filmed version of a stage performance of Shakespeare's Richard III, which is absolutely straight out of Thomas More. It's a
mm,
fabulous play.
mm.
It's a fabulous parable of evil and power and so on. But it ain't the history.
No.
And I think most people accept that. Even people who believe that Richard was responsible for doing away his nephews say, look, that was perfectly normal behaviour for an early Renaissance prince, and the other things he did were very, you know, constructive, legal reforms and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, he's a mixture of dark and light, as most people actually are. The the Olivier performance, though, fixed, I think, in the public mind that caricature of the humpback Richard,
Mm.
which had gone down from Shakespeare through the 16th, 17th, 18th century, 19th century.
Mm.
Olivier's performance is allegedly based on Sir Henry Irving's performance of Richard.
Okay.
And in fact, there's a very early recording of Irving, it's believed to be Irving's voice, doing the "Now is the Winter of Our Discontent" speech, which sounds very like the way Olivier did it.
Okay. Okay.
You
So
know, so we're dealing with a really embedded culture. But on the flip side of that,
mhm,
since really, you know, Horace Walpole in the 18th century, there's been a move to rehabilitate Richard as a good guy,
mm,
somebody who was a good king who meant well, tried to do the right thing, was very badly let down by advisors like the Duke of Buckingham, who may be the person who was really responsible for doing away with the princes, if they were done away with at all. And that comes right down to into the 20th century, when in the early, just after the war, an author called Josephine Tay wrote a book called Daughter of Time,
mhm,
which her detective hero is laid up in bed with a broken leg, and to stop him going mad with boredom, looks into the Richard III story and decides that there's actually this is a person who doesn't ring, he doesn't come across to a copper as a bad one.
yeah.
And so as the story develops, the evidence is presented that Richard may have been traduced by history, traduced by people like Thomas More,
Mhm,
people, you know, not looking behind the veneer of Thomas More as a saint, the man for all seasons, and so on. You know, forgetting the bit that, you know, he quite happily went out and burnt heretics.
mhm,
And that gave a whole lease of life to what's called the Ricardian movement. And in fact, just to bring it up to and show how it sort of penetrated popular culture, my mum, when I was growing up in the 1970s as a teenager, my mum was a Ricardian.
okay. Mhm,
She loved Richard III. She talked about my Richard III. She collected loads of books, and in fact, this was a book that was published in the mid 1970s. It's called
mhm,
Some Touch of Pity, and by an author called Rhoda Edwards, and it's a revisionist novel.
right.
Richard is the sort of romantic hero who suffers appalling pain in his own life. His first of all, his wife. First of all, his young son dies, and
Mhm,
his wife dies. He's betrayed by everybody and ultimately dies at Bosworth.
mm,
And then again, just after I was at university, and Channel 4 did. This is the book of a film. It was a whole evening in the early days of Channel 4 called The Trial of Richard III.
mhm,
They could do that. That was an audience grabber,
mm.
and they got modern QCs and a modern judge to treat Richard as a murder suspect
To interrogate
and
the evidence.
interrogate the evidence through modern
Mm,
historians, one of whom, and again, the TV series is out there, I think, on YouTube. Do look it up. It's great fun to watch,
mhm,
particularly as it's one of the earliest TV appearances of Dr. David Starkey, who is deliciously put back in his box by a leading QC. So
I won't comment on what he's doing now with his life. Yeah.
no, absolutely. But put it this way, it's a delicious TV moment. But courtroom drama, one of the great unsolved mysteries, criminal cases in British history. So even before you start to look for Richard
Hmm.
physically,
Hmm.
people have been trying to look for Richard intellectually and emotionally in different places for the last 400 years, 500 years.
Okay, so I have two questions then. As someone who I never really studied that transition from Plantagenet to the Tudors, the Reformation onwards was something that was a big interest, especially coming from Wales. That was intriguing.
Yeah.
But two questions. First one: is there a sense then, therefore, amongst Ricardians and others that potentially the a little bit like William the Conqueror coming in and setting a new course for British English
Mm.
history. Is there a sense that that's what happened with Richard III and the Battle of Bosworth? That actually somehow we're on an alternate timeline, and that had things gone otherwise, we might have had more Plantagenets. Is that fair to say?
That's a really interesting one. I mean, certainly, if you look at the Shakespeare play, the moment his wife's dead, and again, the implication is that Richard's had her killed or
Hmm.
killed her.
Hmm.
But he's looking for another marriage because everybody knows that at that period, if you don't have the heir and the spare, you're
Yep.
done.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Um, and your line's done. But I mean, I think the other thing about it, in terms of the Tudors,
Hmm.
you know, Richard is this swashbuckling to Ricardians. Richard is this humane Renaissance prince, this swashbuckling end of the Plantagenets who dies tragically, and who knows what he might have done had he been able to live.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and they look in contrast at Henry VII, the spider who sits at the center of the web in the Palace of Westminster. The man and the hero again of Daughter of Time makes the point, this is somebody who, in order to be able to execute Richard's supporters after Bosworth, backdates the attainder, declaring them traitors to the day before the Battle of Bosworth, so that even though they were following the anointed king, they could be executed for treason.
Oh, okay. Okay. So if they weren't treasonous before, they are now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So. In other words, yes. There's a lot of. It's about perspective. It's about
Oh, yeah.
which way you think the timeline or these family feuds, these houses, might have gone.
And if you think about it, you think of what a dividing moment. If you want to find dividing moments in history, August 1485 is, because if Richard lives, if Henry's killed, and he very nearly was
Mm-hmm.
at Bosworth,
Mm-hmm.
um, then you don't get Henry VIII.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get the Reformation in the way that it happened
Mm-hmm.
in Britain. You dissolution of the monasteries and so on. It's arguable we might still be a Catholic country like France.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Would we have had a revolution later on, like the French did during the Enlightenment?
Mm-hmm.
No. If you like counterfactuals, and if you
Mm-hmm.
like if you like history as a romantic sweep, then Richard is absolutely there as a. And so you can see why people like Philippa Langley can get caught up in the story.
Well, that leads me to question number two. And question
Mm.
number two is: do you think, therefore, that any attempt to find Richard III was bound to have drama surrounding it, and bound to have passion come to the fore?
Yeah, and look, there's two reasons for that.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, and this is alluded to in the film, and uh, I'm going to say, please watch the film with an open mind.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Well,
Because
I
it's
have.
not going
Yeah.
to be the film that it's not going to be the film that you think you're going to see if you've read certain of the criticisms of the film. And again, we can talk about that in more detail
In
in
a
a
moment.
bit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but what you're seeing, I think, is a magical realist parable about somebody trying to find themselves through finding an enthusiasm.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, it happens to be for a particular historical character. It could as easily be she could as easily have discovered that she was a natural football coach and wanted to go out and teach the local youth football team to go out and win the cup. You
Yep.
know,
Yep.
it's that kind of parable. You've got this element of magical realism where, as the more the Philippa Langley character is drawn into the search for the lost king,
Mm-hmm.
um, she actually begins to, first of all, see him,
Mm-hmm.
see in inverted commas,
Based on
and then, yeah,
yeah, there's a
yeah,
reason. There's a
yeah.
reason for that visage. Yeah.
Oh yeah, everything within the film has a rationale.
Yeah.
There is magical realism in it, but it has an underlying realism. Whether it's a realism that will be recognised, for example, by all the archaeologists involved or whatever, that's what's been in question. But certainly, what you've got is a story arc that reflects what happened, even if it's not an exact copy of what happened. And it can't ever be an exact copy of what happened because it's a fiction, it's a feature film, it's a drama,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So I know, what you're following is a slightly lost person looking for a king who's lost to history, literally, and in terms of what they actually did and were and represent.
Mm-hmm.
and and this culminates in the discovery of the king, but in the shot reveal moment, which is actually alluded to in the script, when the king's remains are uncovered in that car park in Leicester
Mm-hmm.
by the Leicester archaeologists. Of course, the first thing that people notice is the curvature on the spine, the scoliosis. What we now know is scoliosis.
Mm-hmm.
What they took to be the hunchback when they
Mm-hmm.
first discovered it,
Mm-hmm.
before it was properly medically diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the characters says the Ricardians are going to hate that, because they'd had this romantic image that the humpback and the withered arm was was Tudor propaganda.
Well,
To
actually, I
to,
think I
to
think I think the character says the Tudor apologists are going to have a field day.
Sorry, yes, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah,
Yeah. Mm.
yeah. And when in fact we now know that that Richard had scoliosis, curvature of the spine, but although his body was not heavily muscled and so on, it wouldn't have been visible, apart from maybe a slightly higher shoulder on one side. But it
Right.
wouldn't have been visible if it wouldn't have been visible if you met him, and it
Mm.
certainly wouldn't have stopped him being a very effective soldier, which we know he was.
Mm. Mm. And so,
You
well,
know,
and so in that sense, there's also an argument that there's as a public exposure to what looks like quite a gross in terms of effect, not gross in terms of disgusting, um, uh,
mm,
a dramatic deviation from a normal shape of spine, as it were.
mm,
What it's doing is also possibly rehabilitating the notion that the Hunchback of Notre Dame or other characters who physically look a certain way, as you've just been alluding to in terms of historic
mm,
performances,
yeah,
are necessarily therefore evil, i.e.,
yeah.
disability equals is right down to your soul. You're just a bad person because
Yeah,
you deviate from
the
what's
outside is a reflection of the inside, which we
yeah
know, of course, is absolute BS.
yeah yeah
It's offensive BS,
mm,
but that's a 21st century point of view. People haven't always thought that,
no
you know.
no. Well,
Um,
and also I would then again I would also say that, for example, in the early 20th century, people definitely thought that. So
yeah,
so we have we are rehabilitating ourselves as a society on that front as well, certainly,
mm,
and actually to bring it right up to back to to a modern academia, characters like, for example, real life people, but characters in the popular sense, like Stephen Hawking,
mm,
have been commonly represented as being actually the opposite. Someone who has merits despite disability. So that's just an interesting little subtext that's definitely brought through in the film, I think, certainly.
mm,
Hmm.
yeah.
So what about then? What about Philippa Langley? What how do you think she's portrayed in this film, and how do you think it matches up with, I suppose, what we observed and were able to observe at the time in 2012 and into 2013 Tell I'll go first, and you can counter me if you want to.
Okay, go on then.
I remember Philippa coming across as passionate to the
Yeah.
point of distraction. I remember her coming across as someone who seemed to have borderline, what felt like a romantic obsession with this man, and or at the very least, a familial desire to look after him and his character.
Mm.
And she, throughout the discovery process and through into the announcement in 2013, was very prominent. Very often, especially when they did the reconstruction of his head, she was also always photographed right next to him. And I remember
Mm.
being professionally slightly uncomfortable when, for example, she rushed to drape a flag over his remains before they even knew who they'd found in the car park. Or, for example, in
They
that,
had a pretty good idea who they'd found.
yeah, but unless you don't do that,
Yeah,
archaeologists
no,
don't do that.
no.
Um,
There's a, and again, there's a media angle to that which we need to discuss in a minute.
and also, speaking of
Yeah, no.
media, in, for example, the documentary, again, it's an edited piece of television. Therefore, they want some drama, especially on Channel 4 at 9 p.m.
Mm.
They highlighted that she could scarcely handle, seemingly, people talking about the skeleton as almost like, as an artifact as opposed to a human being. Now, in this instance, I don't blame her for that. I think that's quite a normal reaction. Humans seeing a skeleton want to relate to it as a human being, I think, quite naturally. But what we had there was a slight
Mm.
clash, just maybe even a slight butting of heads between a scientific description of human remains and a what seemed to be a sort of a nostalgic desire to relate to the human in front of them. I think that's probably the most generous way I can describe my impression of her at the time. The
Mm.
least generous way I'd describe it was that I thought she was a bit intense. I thought she was potentially a little bit obsessed, and maybe even unhealthily so at times. But again, we're talking about how she's portrayed in newspaper and also how she's portrayed on
Yeah,
television. So I don't know the woman, and therefore I couldn't possibly fully
no,
state with certainty. What do you think?
no. Um, it's really interesting. I think I would agree with you in terms of a lot of the media presentation
Hmm.
of Philippa Langley.
Hmm.
Now, again, we are not in this film judging the real Philippa Langley. We're judging a film where she's portrayed beautifully by Sally Hawkins, who's a very fine actor
Hmm.
and very good at playing slightly quirky characters,
Hmm.
um, and is given enough material to work with by Steve Coogan, who's the co-writer with his regular writing partner, um, Jeff Pope, of the film. I mean, their previous best-known film was Philomena,
Yeah.
and slightly in a similar way, this particular screenplay gives Coogan a lead role, but deferring to a strong female lead. In Philomena, it's Judi Dench. In this film, it's Sally Hawkins. Um,
Now that's it. Could I just pick you up on that? In so much as the film says it's her story, and yet it edits out of the story things like her draping a flag over his remains as he's recovered. It sort of rushes past these moments that do make her seem a bit emotionally intense. It is possibly rehabilitating her a little bit. And certainly one of the stated goals of this film in its marketing has been to ensure that she's restored to a rightful place as being recognised as one of the discoverers of Richard III. But as I just said, in my mind, she was never out of the picture. She was always front and centre, certainly in the media coverage. So I know you say this is a character and
yeah,
this is a dramatization, but it's a dramatization that they say is based on real life and that we know happened. These events happen and we all watch them happen. So how can we constructively relate to this in that sense when it's clearly doing its best to, yes, show that she's quirky, but not show some of those things that made myself and also some of our colleagues quite uncomfortable at the time?
I think some of our colleagues were made uncomfortable by some of the portrayals in the film, and by, for example, that moment when in the Channel 4 documentary, the the box with the bones in is covered with the royal standard of the Plantagenets,
Mm,
if I
mm,
remember rightly.
yeah.
It's a sort of it's a slightly eggy moment. It's certainly a TV moment. It's not an archaeological moment.
Mm,
But then I think you have to remember as well that first of all, uh, the Looking for Richard project, uh, there was every reason to think at that moment that it had fulfilled its purpose.
mm-hmm,
That all the money that they crowdfunded from Ricardians all over the world had been well spent.
mm-hmm,
Um, and the TV producers wanted a moment.
mm.
They weren't going to wait, X months for the DNA work to
Well, except they had
report
to.
back and so on.
That's the point. They had to.
No, they didn't,
Like they did.
because they were making a doc.
Because they had to do. They did the documentary announcement after the DNA work, after the paleopathology work had been done in 2013. They did have to wait months for it to be actually confirmed. They just wanted to have a dramatic Indiana Jones moment.
And there's nothing wrong with that. As a TV producer,
Yeah,
as
yeah,
an
yeah.
archaeologist, as an archaeologist, you and I are uncomfortable with that. As archaeologists, the whole idea of starting an excavation, and this is covered in the film,
Hmm.
albeit not in a huge amount of detail. It's certainly
Well,
there in the book.
also, I would say, sorry, not in a terribly sympathetic way, but go ahead.
That's a whole other issue, and we'll come to that in a minute as well,
Yeah,
I'm sure.
yeah.
But look, that 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 was a moment in the documentary. It's not shown in the film because they don't need to show it in the film. We in the film, first of all, people go into the film knowing that they find Richard, so you don't need that moment. You're there following Philippa Langley. You're following her quest. It's a quest movie as
Yeah.
well as a magical realist parable.
Hmm.
So
Well,
whether or
sorry.
whether or not something's shown in the documentary but isn't shown in the film, or shown in the film but wasn't in the documentary, I don't mind about that. They're
No,
different versions of the same story.
No, I think you're misunderstanding me, possibly deliberately. I don't know, but the reason why I say that is that I'm not saying the two had to match up. We didn't need the
Mm,
King in the Car Park documentary remade by Steve Coogan and co.
no.
But what I would say is that what they chose to show about her, and therefore actually what she chose as a producer to have
Mm,
shown about her,
yeah.
was clearly selected, and they did not select that moment, which was something which was so heightened as to seem at times quite uncomfortable. What if those hadn't been his remains?
Mm,
Obviously, we'd never have seen the footage, I guess, but
yeah.
but it still would have happened, and it still would have been something that she
Mm,
did and that she wanted to do, and that her emotions and her time of life and her desires
mm,
drove her to do in a way that would not normally happen in an archaeological site. I'm not. The reason why I'm going to great lengths to it to highlight this as a point of
mm,
contrast is that I also feel as though the film needs, because it's a drama, it needs a bad guy.
mm,
And if Richard III, one of the most famous bad guys of all time, can't be the bad guy,
mm,
then the
yeah.
University of Leicester sort of fills that role to a
Mm,
certain extent. And if not bad, then certainly incompetent at times. So, for example, there's a moment in the movie where she's like, "Well, why don't you lay this map on top of that map and see what similarities there are?" And
mm,
a professor and a PhD candidate, I think, in the room go, "Oh, we've never done that. No one's ever done that before." Of course, they've fucking done it before. We do it all the bloody time. I mean, in that sense, the portrayal of academia as being stuffy and as being incompetent and never thinking to overlay maps was such a caricature as to again highlight this perspective that the film has and that it's trying to push. She is not kooky, or as kooky as she seemingly was in real life, and they are stuffy and inept. certainly more so than they probably were in real life. Yeah, there's a
Hmm.
perspective which made me as a viewer, if we're talking about a review of this movie, uncomfortable. I didn't like it because not because I'm an archaeologist, but because I thought it was disingenuous. They didn't need to push these characters to those extremes, or to make archaeologists seem like buffoons in that sense.
Right. Okay. And here we come to the real controversy, which is how the University of Leicester and the University of Leicester archaeologists were presented
Yeah.
by the film, which got to the stage where members of the University of Leicester Archaeology Service and the University of Leicester senior management team were quoted as suggesting they were exploring the possibility of legal action against the producers. It was never going to happen.
No, no.
What they were trying to do,
And it also gave the movie tremendous boost in terms of publicity. But
of course, it did.
yeah,
And the point was, you know, the moment you do any reading around this,
mm-hmm.
you know, that it is absolutely clear, and it's there in Philippa Langley's book, which she, as I say, she co-wrote with Michael Jones, and it's there in the book that the late Professor the late John Ashdown Hill wrote,
Mm-hmm.
that there were frictions between the University of Leicester
Mm-hmm.
and Philippa Langley and the Looking for Richard project.
Yeah. I mean,
For example,
I remember hearing about them.
yeah,
You know, on the down low.
for example,
Yeah.
yeah, and for example, you talked about historical research. A lot of the research on two lines, one on the DNA, on the lines of descent, which enable the DNA work to be undertaken, finding the contemporary descendants of Richard's close family,
Mm-hmm.
which enabled the DNA work to take place, but also the work on what happened and where to Richard's remains after Bosworth, in particular when they got to Leicester,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that they ended up in the Greyfriars Church, which then ended up in a late 16th century garden, with a garden feature apparently over a significant grave.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's a number of people, including John Ashdown Hill, and that all happened way before the University of Leicester came on the scene.
Did it happen before Philippa Langley came on scene?
It was
Did she
happening.
personally discover those things?
It doesn't matter if she discovered those things personally. She worked with those people. The Looking for Richard project was working with those people who'd done that research.
Yeah.
And the University of Leicester coming on the scene enabled the archaeology to happen, because they could come up, you know, they had the staff, they had the expertise, they had
apply for licenses. Yep. Mm-hmm.
they could apply exactly all of that.
Yeah.
All of that. One of the things about the film is, you know, the film gives the impression it all happened in about 18 months or so. In fact, the timeline is more like around 8 years, almost a decade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Philippa Langley had been researching Richard from the early noughties.
Yeah.
And the Looking for Richard project was a thing before the University of Leicester became involved in it.
Well, but also, I have a story for you from the 1980s, 1989, I think. A friend of mine's mum, he was growing up in Leicester, took him to that car park, pointed at the ground, and said, "That's where Richard III is."
Yeah,
people knew.
No,
people knew.
Yes, of course.
But again, the drama makes it out to be her in the same way that one would do in a National Treasure movie with Nicolas Cage. And that's
Shakespeare's movie starts with Richard standing on the steps of the throne, and the play. You know, it starts with Richard standing on the steps of the throne, saying how you know, I may smile and yet be a villain, and how he's going to murder his way to the throne.
Yeah,
you know, it's not real. You can't include everything.
So why market it? So I know I keep on interrupting you, but why market it?
That's right.
As a rehabilitation of a woman who was horribly done by the academic establishment, but restoring her to her rightful position as one of the discoverers of Richard III. She was never out of the picture. No, there was friction.
On that
there was
differ.
friction. There was definitely friction.
Exactly.
But she was never out of the public picture. And that's who we're talking about here as an audience. If you're talking about a movie, this is a
Mm,
public drama for
yeah.
Joe Public.
Mm.
And therefore it's suggesting that she was borderline disenfranchised.
If you read the um, the accounts of Philippa Langley and John Ashdown Hill,
Hmm.
there are moments when they allege that that is exactly what was going on.
Hmm. Hmm.
They were not happy bunnies about the way they've been treated by the machine that is a large corporate body like a modern university.
Yes. Yeah.
And you know, um, so and I say that as I said earlier, a lot of the criticism of the film has come from people who are looking at the film from the point of view of the University of Leicester, and the narrative that the University of Leicester which the University of Leicester had established with itself at the centre of the story and its expertise at the centre of the story. Now,
Hmm.
there's no question that, yes, some very good archaeologists and some very good lab work was done by the University of Leicester, and they did support the project.
Well,
The argument is
speaking of disenfranchisement, I mean, who is missing
mm,
then from this story?
you tell me. I think, in terms of a film lasting just under 2 hours,
Hmm.
it's a pretty lean, well-told tale.
Yeah.
It's not brilliant. It's not the greatest film ever made. It's certainly not even Stephen Frears, the director's best ever,
No.
best film.
No. But it.
I
But
don't
it.
think it's as good as Philomena, and Philomena's been criticised for historical inaccuracies.
Yes. Yeah. But
But again, it's a film.
but it's
You know,
also a film which is attempting to to tell her story, but actively hides some of the female archaeologists, for example, who are working on the excavation. Doesn't
right?
mention that they
Okay,
were there.
okay.
Doesn't
Two
show them.
things. Right. Crash course in dramatic writing.
Yeah.
Okay. The story arc. The film is called, The Lost King. It's about finding Richard.
Yeah.
When they excavate the human remains that were a few feet away from that famous R in the car park,
Hmm. Hmm.
which sadly ended up, I think, in a skip. It would have been, as somebody pointed out, it would have made the perfect centerpiece for the Richard III exhibition in Leicester. That actually had the tarmac R
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
Anyway, that's another story. That's another story. Yeah, the the way the story has been told, it culminates in recovering those remains, and then you fast forward to the press conference where they announce their academic conclusion. The archaeologists are allowed to announce that their academic conclusion is Richard Buckley is given that line,
Hmm.
which is taken pretty much verbatim from the press conference.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and and then you have the dying fall of the funeral and the the corporate dinner on the one hand juxtaposed with Philippa Langley going to talk about finding Richard to a school of to a girls' school, and the implication is those kids are going to be empowered by her story to go and find their own Richards,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's a point of view. They cut two things in the actual excavation.
Hmm.
Joe Appleby, the osteologist who is shown in the film recovering the remains,
Hmm.
was accompanied by Turi King, who ended up also doing a lot of the DNA work.
Yeah.
Two expert women archaeologists, only one of whom was shown.
Yeah.
And the DNA work was referred to but was not shown at all.
No. No.
As a writer, I can give you a perfectly good reason for that.
Hmm.
One, you don't show the two people in the trench because it makes it more difficult to film and more difficult to show. You don't need a second person because what you're showing is the remains being recovered,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So you're not. It's a perfectly sensible, practical decision. Plus, you're paying one less actor,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You don't need to show the DNA work, which isn't particularly cinematic anyway. What matters is the result.
Come on, every CSI episode ever made has cinematic DNA work in it. You could, if they wanted to. I'm not saying that they had to, but but my point is, there are ways of telling this story that didn't.
If you look at if you look at the way they've chosen to structure it,
Yeah.
it wouldn't have worked.
No. No.
Another thing, another thing they've done, they as I say, they telescope the timeline so it appears much shorter than it actually was in real life. Philippa Langley's kids don't appear to age at all.
No.
That and and there's a lot of complex emotional stuff that doesn't happen or is sort of alluded to in snapshots,
email stuff and stuff like that. All this other bickering that might have happened, and so and you have the sort of the sense of jeopardy come obsession moment. So, for example, when she bunks off work to get the train from Edinburgh down to Leicester to go and visit the car park for the first time, there are cinematic games being played there which are absolutely valid because it's a fictional film. It's a magical realist parable. But that's the problem. It's not fiction, and this is why so many of our colleagues are so upset about it. It's not fiction. Richard III was found, and now he's buried in a formal grave. It happened. It's not fiction. It's a bio. You could say it's a dramatization, perhaps. Maybe that's another way of putting it. But so I didn't really expect myself to be getting this passionate. but I think it's partly I'm partly irritated by, and it plays into this the broader portrayal of archaeologists in the media. The word baffled is almost always accompanying archaeological discoveries. I don't like the idea that that's the best way that people can think of as portraying archaeologists, especially in such a an excavation that was there was a global focus. There was reported on around the world. Regardless of the interpersonal problems that might have occurred, what we got in this film was one person's story and one person's perspective on what happened, despite the fact that there was a global media presence that was recording almost everything that was happening. In that sense, there were other resources to draw on for this drama, but it's as part of its marketing, as part of Steve Coogan's interest in it. He's done countless interviews where he's talked about the need to give Philippa Langley her dues. I just find it ironic that they remove women in particular from that trench and from the DNA process when apparently they're trying to restore women against a stuffy university corporate masculine sort of presence. It is. You can see why it's a problem for so many people, or why they notice it.
I can see why they notice it. I think they're too close to it as archaeologists. I think they need to step back at it, back at it, and look at it from a point of view of storytelling, from a point of view of it's a parable. It's not an academic monograph.
No,
it's a parable.
No, and also crucially,
and parables are often invented stories.
They are, but except this isn't an invented story. Again, this happened. But the other thing as well,
no. A version of this happened.
Yes, a version of this.
And this is a version of those happening being put on. Don't forget, this isn't Richard Buckley's project or even John Ashdown Hill's project. It's Philippa Langley's project. You've got a woman at the centre of the story.
Yes, you have. Yeah, that's true. But I mean, you said how this isn't a monograph. I think something that our colleagues have missed, though, and I commented on this a couple of months ago when things were kicking off around the Canada release and then I think a release in other places. I think the UK cinematic release as well, is that these guys aren't looking for feedback. They're not looking for a peer review. By the time the film is in front of people who aren't editing it, they're already moving on to another project. Films are made in terms of production. What happens is, and I know you'll know this, Andy, but just for people at home who may not know, essentially a production company is made to make a film. It exists as an economic, as a financial entity for the duration of that production, and then at the end of that production, it is dispersed, and then profits are made based on that work. It's one of the reasons why some I know an awful lot of great movies, props, for example, and set pieces are lost to time because when the film was made, it was not yet a classic, and stuff is reused or sold or even thrown away because these are short, these are sort of hot fires that are made to forge a movie, and then they're extinguished, and then another one is started. So by the time it's in the cinema, Coogan is already thinking about his next project, and his production company is already working on one or two others. So I think that's something that has been missed. Is this that they're not after a peer review? They're not, and in that sense, they don't consider archaeologists to be their peers. And I know that might sound as though I'm now stepping a bit away from that sort of passionate defence of archaeologists and a bit more into the real world. But it's, I think that's important to acknowledge, is that as much as it irks us, it's happened, it can't be relitigated. You know, we can't rewrite it. It's been
No,
told. The story's been
look,
told.
yeah, exactly. Look, if archaeologists are upset about the way that archaeology is portrayed in The Dig or in The Lost King,
Hmm.
you know, write a screenplay, get it commissioned, get it made, get it released. You know, um,
Have a 20
it's
minute scene where people are drawing
exactly,
yeah, the side of a trench. Yeah.
exactly. Why is Indiana Jones never shown recording a trench? Because it's effing boring to watch.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. It's much more
yeah.
exciting just
So
to punch a Nazi.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think, you know, if archaeology is going to be portrayed as drama,
Hmm.
and you know, it does have a very patchy record.
Hmm.
There was, okay. I had some fun last week with with an April Fool joke about the CBA wanting to commission a series to show archaeology properly after The Dig and The Lost King,
Yeah. We'll link to that
and they
below.
brought. Yes,
Yeah.
and the idea was that the CBA had brought in the producers and writers of a series called Bone Kickers.
Oh
Um,
God.
just Google it, folks. Um, you know,
Do you know
so
what? We're going to have to, at some point. We're going to have to do a retrospective Unstratified Entertainment about that series. We'll go back. We'll find it and have a.
it is legendary.
It's
It is
legend. It's
legendary.
so bad. It's so bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you think there's a row about the way archaeology is portrayed in The Lost King. You ain't seen Bone Kickers.
No.
But anyway, look. In all seriousness, uh, I think, you know, if you're treating archaeology as drama and archaeologists as dramatic characters,
Hmm.
and of course there is a particular issue when you're dealing with real life characters, whether it's the people who were involved in the dig at Sutton Hoo, or it's the people who were involved in the dig in the social services car park in Leicester.
Hmm.
Um, what I would say, I don't see anybody being traduced in that film. What I do see is an impression given of the way modern archaeology within a corporate setting
Hmm.
brings pressures.
Yeah.
And I do wonder if that's what some people are upset at being shown. It's a part of the profession that we talk about a lot on Watching Brief,
Hmm.
but isn't part of the normal archaeological discourse on things like Dig for Brit. Yeah.
Yeah. So for example, the fact that Vindolanda always strategically, seemingly finds interesting things at a certain time of the year when they're looking to get volunteers on site to dig.
Yeah.
You know, a very handy press release goes out, it makes national news. It's a game that is played. Yeah. And the same
Yeah.
goes, for example,
Exactly.
for Pompeii. You know, Pompeii does something very similar. You know, yeah. Hmm.
Exactly that. But you know, and it's slightly awkward to admit that's what happened, that's what happens, and particularly when it comes to archaeological archaeological units, contracting units, who are basically guns for hire, and that's made clear in this.
Is that one of the? Is
Um,
that also one of the issues here? Is the fact that it portrays archaeologists as being the archaeology department, for example, at Leicester, as being awfully close to the brink, because it may not be deemed to be a worthy subject by the university itself.
there are undercurrents of that, certainly,
Hmm.
and how much of that screenplay, particularly the latter two-thirds of that, well, sorry, the middle third of the middle act of the movie is about raising money.
Mm.
It's about raising money to pay the Leicester archaeologists.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's about a ground penetrating radar survey not showing any grave cuts on the car park site, almost scuppering the project. And that happened.
Yeah.
Langley
Yeah.
describes it in her book. It's described elsewhere.
Yeah.
That the fact that ground penetrating radar survey was so inconclusive, it almost knocked the project on the head.
Yeah. Yeah.
Channel 4 almost backed out.
Yeah.
With Channel 4 almost backing out, the Leicester Tourist organisation, which was also co-funding, also looked almost backed out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why Philippa Langley and the Looking for Richer project ended up crowdfunding.
Yeah. Yeah. In that sense, it was a relatively early crowdfunding attempt in terms of this was pre-Kickstarter, really, and people commonly using those sorts of websites for these sorts of projects. Yeah,
it was done through email forums.
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, shall we try and bring this to some sort of close? I mean, I have one final point I'd like to make about the culinary connections between controversial archaeological dramas.
I'm sorry, I do have a cold cup of coffee here. I don't have any lemon drizzle cake, unfortunately.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, okay. Tell you what. That's my closing comment. Is this the real connection here in terms of getting archaeologists annoyed? Do you put lemon drizzle cake in a film, and it's like catnip?
It's been a misdirection. Look over there, someone not recording a trench. Look over there, lemon drizzle cake.
Lemon drizzle cake. Oh my god! I mean, it's delicious. I'm sure no one would disagree. No, both the Dig and the Lost King have lemon drizzle cake turn up. No. In all seriousness, is there anything finally that you'd like to say about this film? I mean, obviously, we haven't really talked about some very specific moments of criticism that have happened online, because I don't necessarily want to be accused of pointing certain people out, and I also don't want to be accused of actually stoking those fires again. But what's your takeaway as an archaeologist? Again, we're reviewing this as both people who love film, but also as archaeologists.
Look, my takeaway from it as an archaeologist is that now maybe I'm not enough of an archaeologist anymore to be. I'm not as close to it as some of the people who have clearly, for whatever reason, felt they've been their profession has been traduced by it. I wonder. I do wonder
as well.
Their professionalism. Yeah. Now, I do wonder, given that the film hadn't actually been released in this country when a lot of the criticism happened, how many people who made those criticisms and felt hurt, aggrieved, actually saw the film. Because, when I watched the film, I can see why people pointed out certain things, that certain things in the film timeline didn't happen in the historical timeline, and so on and so on and so on. But as I said, as somebody who watches a lot of film, as somebody who writes, as somebody who's been involved in making TV, I can see why those decisions were made by by Steve Coogan and Pope and Stephen Frears and the production team, because you can't show everything, you mustn't show everything, because otherwise you'd end up with a
6 month long movie.
Pretty exactly. Do you do it like Andy Warhol? You point a camera at the side of a skyscraper for 7 hours and release that.
Yeah.
Every film, every documentary, even when it's a historical documentary based on impeccable sources, is a construct.
Well,
and
decisions
are made in the building of that construct.
Yeah, and in that sense, just to dig down a little bit on that, every scene in a documentary, but certainly in a movie, has to do probably at least 3 different things. It has to be establishing stuff and character-driven stuff and so on and so forth. And so in that sense...
moving the plot forward and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah. And so therefore, even as you say, an impeccably produced documentary is going to have to truncate stuff
Mm.
I mean, another interesting example of this is that another profession would be physics, for example, physicists.
Mm. Yeah.
When Chernobyl, the drama, was released, there were
Mm.
three key figures who were actually squashed down to one character in that
Yeah.
drama,
Yeah.
and she. It's ridiculous when you know a bit about even archaeologists, and the way my experience of the way that the academia and offices work, you sort of realize she can't do that job and that job, surely not, and she can't be in the field as well.
Mm.
But for the drama, for a viewer, and for someone who didn't want to have to figure out what everyone's individual job was, she was science lady, and she was doing this, and this, and she was moving the plot forward, and she was
It's the Emily Watson character, who's one of the most compelling characters in the whole
yeah.
program, and is the the linchpin of the plot and the go between for the audience in discovering what actually happened that terrible
Yeah,
during those terrible weeks.
and also in that drama, she's a key point in establishing some form of justice, in terms of
Yeah.
dramatic justice. So
Yes.
so yeah, these things happen. And do you think
Mm.
part of the problem is just that when you have a bit of insight, you can go, ugh, that's a bit crass, isn't it? Yeah, that's a bit rushed. That's a
Yeah.
bit
Look,
unnuanced.
exactly. It's like look. It's like I was saying earlier. You know, in the film, Joe Appleby is the archaeologist who excavates the human remains. The Joe Appleby of the film in that moment is an amalgamation of Joe Appleby and Turi King.
Yeah, yeah,
You know that if you've read the background sources.
yeah.
It doesn't matter in terms of the film if you've read the background source. It makes sense in terms of the screenplay,
Hmm.
in terms of the story arc.
Hmm.
And as I said, there's other practical reasons why it was done. It might well have been done like that.
Hmm.
And I mean, I think in the end, if we're going to ask, if we're going to say to people, do you watch the film? Yeah, it's an enjoyable, just under 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
It's if you like a sort of as I say, a magical, realistic, sorry, magical, not realistic, a magical, realist parable about a piece of history which has been fictionalized, romanticized,
Dramatized.
traduced, explained, dramatized for the last
Mm-hmm.
500 years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also, look at the film and look at the film on its own terms.
Hmm.
And it's got a really nice cast. As I say, we talked about Sally Hawkins. James Fleet plays John Ashdown Hill very quietly. You've got Mark Addy playing Richard Buckley, the lead archaeologist. Again, he gets complexity in there.
Yeah, there is a character moment, isn't there, later on where he tries to push media attention towards her as opposed to away from her.
Exactly.
So
It's
there is
almost
a
like a
redeeming arc there. Yeah, yeah.
precisely. These things
Or
will,
human moments. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. They're all there if you look for them.
Mm.
And the other thing I would say is, if you want to find out about what really happened when they found the king in the car park,
Mm-hmm.
the lost king, look at the books. Read Philippa Langley's and Michael Jones's book. Read John Ashdown Hill's book.
Mm-hmm.
Read Mike Pitts's book.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere in between all of those, where they intersect, there'll be something like what actually happened in Leicester in 2012, 2013.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think anybody has yet or will ever tell the whole story, and certainly not this movie, which is a movie.
It certainly is. I suppose just to add to that, I agree with everything you've said. I'm not going to repeat what you've just said. One thing I would say is that there is also it's part of a sort of cozy British genre, I think, as well. There's a sort of Love Actually adjacent aspect to it, a little bit like.
I've been trying all this conversation. I've been trying to avoid the words rom-com.
Well, yeah, a little bit of rom-com, perhaps, but more to the
Certainly,
point.
some of the tropes are rom-commy.
Yeah, definitely. But also, I think that aspect of, sometimes it can make, as a Brit watching these sorts of films, you cringe a little bit. You're like, ugh, God, it makes it seem like we all live in cottages and everything, But not that this film does that. But so it's that kind of genre as well. So if you're after something that's that's quite pleasant to watch. then yeah, maybe consider it. But also, just for the sake of and the sanity of some of our colleagues, be aware that
Yeah.
this is a dramatization.
Yeah.
This isn't reality. This isn't a first, a true account of everything. Yeah, yeah. Well,
But what is truth? But what is truth, as somebody once said at this time of year?
oh, indeed, no matter. What is matter? Never mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time, Andy. I can hear people in the background getting, no
Okay.
doubt, a little bit antsy. Do comment below. Do discuss this movie if you have an opinion yourself. Keep the conversation as civil as possible. And I suppose I'm off to enjoy a nice piece of lemon drizzle cake. What about you?
I think I'm more a nice pint of real ale.
Oh, okay, nice. Yeah,
I'm
sorry.
I'm I'm, I'm going down. I'm going down the Phil Harding route.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Oh God, yeah. Sorry, I've got story. Another time, we'll talk about Phil Harding at some other point. Thank you guys for watching. Until next time, take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.